The sun was warm as Marcus stepped out of his house, the kind of golden afternoon that made the world feel calm and steady. He adjusted his belt, where his firearm rested securely in its holster, as natural to him as slipping on a wristwatch. For Marcus, carrying his gun wasn't about intimidation, it was about responsibility. Years of service had taught him that safety wasn't just for himself but for the people around him. He had recently moved into this quiet suburban neighborhood, and every step he took down the freshly paved sidewalks felt like a promise of new beginnings. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby yard, sprinklers clicked rhythmically over green lawns, and a gentle breeze carried the smell of barbecue from a neighbor's backyard. He nodded politely at an elderly man trimming hedges and offered a friendly smile to a couple walking their dog. Everything about his presence was calm and ordinary, yet powerful in its quiet confidence. To Marcus, this was more than just a walk. It was a moment to breathe, to reflect on the journey that had brought him here, and to simply enjoy the peace he had earned. But what felt like peace to him looked very different to someone else watching from across the street. From her porch, Karen leaned against the railing, her eyes narrowing at the sight of a black man with a gun. She didn't see the calm in his walk or the kindness in his gestures. Instead, she saw only what her fears told her to see, and in that moment, the stillness of the afternoon began to change. Marcus, unaware of her stare, kept walking, his steps steady, his head lifted, not knowing how quickly one phone call was about to turn his peaceful walk into a storm. Karen's fingers tightened around her phone as she watched Marcus walk farther down the street, the glint of the holstered gun catching her eye like a flashing warning light. Her heart raced, not because Marcus had done anything threatening, but because her mind had already written a story of danger. She whispered to herself, "Not in my neighborhood," before dialing 911 with a shaky hand. Her voice was sharp, urgent, as she told the dispatcher, "There's a suspicious man walking around with a gun. He looks dangerous." On the other end, the operator asked calm, routine questions, but Karen's tone grew more frantic, her words painting Marcus as a threat instead of a man simply enjoying his afternoon walk. As she stood on her porch, neighbors began to notice her pacing, her voice rising, and the repeated mention of the word gun. Curtains shifted, blinds tilted, and soon the quiet street was buzzing with silent judgment and fearful curiosity. A mother pulled her kids inside from the yard, and an older couple paused mid-conversation, staring uneasily in Marcus's direction. Karen felt a surge of self-importance, believing she was protecting the community. "Send someone quickly," she urged, her eyes never leaving Marcus's figure. Within minutes, the distant sound of sirens broke through the calm afternoon, growing louder, closer, until the flashing lights painted the street in red and blue. Karen's chest swelled with pride, convinced she had prevented something terrible from happening. But what she didn't realize was that her call hadn't just summoned the police, it had set in motion a moment that would expose more than she ever intended. While she waited, her neighbors looked on, caught between fear and uncertainty. As Marcus remained unaware of the storm now racing toward him, the sharp wail of sirens shattered the calm, echoing off the quiet suburban houses as two police cruisers came rushing down the street, tires screeching as they stopped only a few feet from Marcus. The sudden commotion froze the entire neighborhood. Children stopped playing, dogs barked behind fences, and neighbors pressed their faces against windows, their phones already pointed to record what looked like the start of a dangerous scene. The officers leaped from their cars, their hands hovering close to their holstered weapons, their eyes locked on Marcus. Shouts filled the air, commands to stop, to not move, to keep his hands visible. For the first time, Marcus realized what had been set in motion, and though his heart beat heavy in his chest, he stood calm and steady, years of discipline guiding his every breath. He slowly raised his hands, not in fear but in control, his expression steady as he spoke in a clear, calm voice that carried authority. "Officers, I am reaching for my identification." Tension hung thick in the air, every second stretching painfully long as the neighbors held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Karen stood proudly at the edge of her lawn, arms folded, certain her call had been justified. But instead of reaching for a weapon, Marcus moved with deliberate care, pulling a small leather badge from his pocket. The golden emblem glinted under the sunlight as he held it high, his voice firm and unwavering. "Federal officer, I'm one of you." The shift was immediate. Shock flashed across the officers' faces, their aggressive stance melting into sudden respect What had begun as a scene of suspicion was already transforming into something Karen and the watching neighborhood had never expected to see. The moment Marcus's badge caught the sunlight, everything shifted. The officers who had arrived tense and ready for confrontation froze, their eyes narrowing in disbelief as they processed the truth. One of them stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the badge, and then recognition softened his features. In an instant, the hostility drained away, replaced with respect. The officer straightened his posture, gave a sharp nod, and then, almost instinctively, raised his hand in salute. The second officer quickly followed, their rigid stance, now one of honor rather than suspicion. Gasps rippled through the neighborhood, as the people watching realized the man they had seen as a stranger with a gun was, in fact, someone who had worn that badge for years, serving and protecting at a level they couldn't have imagined. Marcus lowered his hands calmly, his voice steady as he said, "Gentlemen, I appreciate your quick response, but I think there's been a misunderstanding." The officers exchanged a glance, their embarrassment clear, but their respect unshaken. Karen, who had been standing proudly only moments ago, felt the ground beneath her pride crumble. Her eyes darted around, hoping someone else would still support her. But the neighbors' faces told another story, shame for believing her so quickly, and awe for the man she had tried to accuse. The air that had once been thick with fear now carried a heavy silence, broken only by the hum of idling patrol cars. In less than 42 seconds, the scene had turned completely around. The man thought to be a threat was the one being honored, while the woman who cried danger stood exposed in her own prejudice. As the last echoes of the salute faded, the neighborhood remained frozen in an uneasy silence. Marcus lowered his badge and slid it back into his pocket, with the same calmness he had carried from the start. His eyes met the officers, and with a steady voice he said, "I know you were just doing your job, but this was never supposed to happen." The officers nodded, their posture still respectful, each one clearly embarrassed that a decorated federal officer had been put in such a humiliating position over a false call. Karen, who had once stood so confidently on her porch, now looked small and uneasy. Her face burned red as whispers spread among the neighbors who had watched the entire scene unfold. Some shook their heads in disappointment, others glanced at Marcus with newfound admiration, realizing how quickly they had judged him without knowing the truth. Marcus didn't raise his voice or scold her. Instead, he walked a few steps closer, his presence alone enough to quiet the street. "Next time," he said softly but firmly, "look at the person before you look at your fear." His words carried weight, not just for Karen, but for everyone listening. The lesson hung in the air, undeniable and unforgettable. The officers gave him one final nod of respect before stepping back into their cruisers, the flashing lights fading as they drove away. Neighbors slowly returned inside, humbled by what they had witnessed, but the image of Marcus standing tall would remain with them far longer than the sound of sirens. Without another word, Marcus turned and continued his walk, his steps steady, his dignity unshaken. And though the street grew quiet again, the salute still echoed louder than Karen's call ever would. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Subscribe to the Silent Side US